footage that you just saw shows the global climate strike in Freiburg, a southern German city, or the lack of the global climate strike on the 20th of September. I felt reminded, I don't know how you feel about it, but I felt reminded of some goose-stepping totalitarians like the Nazis or the Chinese, and also of that famous experiment, the wave.
But we are not just some young people skipping school or some adults who are not going to work. We are a wave of change.
So I looked into what the wave actually was. You have all heard about it because of the book, the cinema movie, the musical, the theater play. At one point you have probably met one instance of that entire franchise, this merchandising propaganda machinery. And I thought, okay, maybe I have a look at the experiment and see how the Greta Thunberg cult resembles that original experiment. However, I found that Mr. Jones seems to have created this experiment mostly in his fiction. I mean, there was a real core, and I will explain that in detail later. He wrote a short story. From the short story onwards, the iterations of his narrative began to change, and the original experiment and his short story somehow merged, and the result is very absurd. However, it is based on the concept of real-life authoritarian movements.
If you belong to that small group of people who feel threatened by us, then we have some very bad news for you. Because this is only the beginning. Change is coming, whether they like it or not.
And change is coming, whether you like it or not.
And still I want to go with you through how the Greta Thunberg movement is indeed a reflection of basic authoritarian characteristics. For this video I went through a hell load of documents and video snippets, tried to order them, and I hope you get an overview as to what was real, what is probably real, and what parts are the fiction, and how much does Greta Thunberg and that experiment reflect real-life authoritarianism.
And why? Because this is an emergency. Our house is on fire.
People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
The first day was about discipline. So Mr. Jones came in early to remove all the posters from the walls, clean the desks, and he wrote on the chalkboard, strength through discipline. So he asked the students to follow a number of rules. For example, they were no longer allowed to congregate in groups larger than 3 people. Also in their spare times, I don't know how that was checked, but that was one of the rules. Then another, or the first rule apparently, was that they all had to sit straight, and they had to clasp their hands behind their backs. And when they were asked a question, they had to stand beside the desk and preface every answer with Mr. Jones. The answers were limited to 3 words, and that was also a limitation to the questions. So the questions were something like, Mr. Jones, who? Mr. Jones, what? And Mr. Jones, huh? Of course, a part of this can also be seen in real-life movements. As I said, the project or the experiment was based on real-life observations. So the Greta Thunberg movement, for example, asked for discipline in their daily lives. People are asked not to eat much meat anymore, or to reduce it entirely to nothing. To drive no more cars and instead ride bikes or use other ways of transport, don't fly with planes, and so on. So there are a variety of suggestions that usually come with that Green Party movement.
To look our children in the eyes and say that we did everything we could back then. That is our moral duty. And we will never stop doing that. We will never stop fighting.
Which leads me to day 2.
Steve, where were we yesterday? What was I talking about? Strength through Okay, let me add something to this thought here. Strength through community. La raza.
Originally, the experiment was intended to be only 1 day, but Mr. Jones says it went so well that he extended it to a 2nd day and eventually to a week. And the 2nd day was about community. In that day, he introduced membership cards and armbands, which starts to raise some questions following the chronology. Armbands are a bit difficult to produce, and as he says, there was such an enthusiasm with the movement. It's very difficult to believe that they have created armbands on their own so quickly that they could spread the movement across the school at large, and even to other schools, as he would claim later.
There's rumors that the wave now has an initiation service that I have not thought up. It's spreading to other schools.
They were also given a sharing salute, again like this, that was supposed to look like the Nazi salute. And of course, in real life, this is also reflected on how movements form. Maybe you have already paid attention to how Angela Merkel does this. You should try that yourself. It isn't a very comfortable gesture. That one is a very comfortable gesture and it looks very similar, but try this. This is not what you end up to do. This is not a normal quirk. It seems very deliberate and has become her trademark ever since, as you can see here, as it is projected by the supposedly neutral public broadcaster ZDF during an interview with our Speaker of the Federal Parliament Bundestag, Wolfgang Schäuble. What is also strange about the armband and that salute is that you have to introduce it to 15-year-olds, and it doesn't really look cool to me. I may be wrong about that, because apparently not all generations are equally cool, you know. As his memory keeps collapsing, he also changes his own level of involvement. The initiation rite was not invented by him in the later versions, but was invented by him in his original short story. It says that he decided the roles first because he was an authoritarian. Then it did not so in later instances of the story.
I did not choose the
Nun, ich habe gar nicht die Führer sozusagen ausgewählt. Die Studenten, die Schüler haben ihre eigenen Rollen ausgewählt. Manche wurden Bodyguards, Leibwächter. Das habe ich gar nicht gemacht. Ich habe ihnen nicht verschiedene Rollen gegeben.
And the number of students who volunteer to denounce or denunciate their fellow students for rule breaking also crew. He said he marked the membership cards with X's.
Mittendrin hier, gerade als wir diese Gemeinschaft versucht haben aufzubauen, habe ich mit Karten auch gearbeitet, mit Mitgliedskarten. Alle hatten ihre Mitgliedsausweise oder Ausweise, wie gesagt. Hier habe ich ein X drauf geschrieben und diejenigen, diese drei, die diese Karten bekommen haben, die haben alle gemeldet oder denunziert, die nicht dabei waren, die nicht bei der Welle mitgemacht haben. Und fast alle kamen dann zu mir und erzählten mir von ihren Freunden, was sie gemacht haben, was sie nicht gemacht haben, was sie in der Klasse gemacht haben.
Then he said more than half of the students spoke to him directly, and later the enthusiasm is on the level that the majority of his students suddenly, or the large majority, almost everybody, as he says, almost everybody talked to him to denunciate fellow students. Again, there's a problem with the time frame. How much time do you think has this teacher spent with every individual student so that they could denounce fellow students for breaking his rules? Well, the first day was about discipline, and the second day was about community. They are both linked to the idea of action. So the discipline was about, could be translated to today's "don't eat meat, don't take planes." And the community spirit is also constantly invoked by Greta Thunberg in her speeches as she rattles down all the protests around the world.
Together and united, we are unstoppable.
To create a sense of belonging in the community. Both of these things create a devotion in the followers, and this can then be parlayed into real action.
You say you hear us and that you understand the urgency. But no matter how sad and angry I am, I do not want to believe that. Because if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil, and that I refuse to believe.
This phase is common along all totalitarian movements and cults across the world. And you will find that everywhere where people get a bit derailed. It starts out with something that makes sense to a certain demographic because they are, let's say, less nurtured in that knowledge. And they become empowered by new information, by a specific help, and then they feel a certain loyalty and feel better about themselves, and then they can do something. So the first phase in a totalitarian movement is usually this empowerment phase. Scientology has a very successful anti-drug program that seems to work out, and that's luring people in. The cohesion goes down completely after the third day. It seems like he had prepared 3 days for his merchandising purposes, and then it gets very tricky. You see that in this short interview with a Russian TV journalist, in which he explains the first 3 days very quickly, and then suddenly goes into a general explanation about fascism after day 3.
The first day was discipline, how to have students feel discipline and control. And the second day was community, how to feel a part of a group, how to have membership cards, a salute, trials about being a part of the group. And then the third day was action, how to act out your feelings. So this is all about fascism. What is fascism? It's reliance on a simple answer.
What is also interesting about this video, where Mr. Jones goes through the days and then suddenly veers into fascism instead, is that the left really likes to speak about fascism in very general terms, and also often simply to say, look, a squirrel. They're not really interested in what fascism actually was, in the real movement as it existed, into people. In people who call themselves fascists. They rather try to portray every enemy as a potential or a real fascist.
Good to love your country, but to what end? If you love your country so much that you discriminate against people in your country, maybe it's minorities or people that are different from you, or you discriminate against people who are on the outside of your country. You have these enemies that cause you to be more nationalistic internally. That's not healthy.
They do that by comparing the stuff that is actually part of the fascist movement, but also part of more benevolent movements. For example, modern conservatives are pro-military, pro-police, and the Nazis did not have any anti-military proclivities at all. The real communists actually don't either, but that's a different topic. So the game is that everything is mentioned that is already truly a part of both groups, of the ideas of both groups, and then those ideas that don't match are thrown into what I call the substitute game. The substitute game is to replace everything in the fascist movement with something that happens in the conservative movement today, for example, or other movements that the left objects to. So Muslims become Jews, Vietnam War becomes the Second World War, and burning books is just as anti-free speech as just asserting your opinion on Twitter strong enough that others feel their feelings are so hurt they cannot object to it logically. That is the substitute game. You pick something that is a part of the fascist movement and claim that it is just like something that you see today. Supposedly, his experiment was 5 days, and this is also contradicted with the overall student newspaper portrayal of the events, because they all agree, all the students, everybody involved agree that the experiment started on a Monday.
Steve, that's a great question. I'll take it up on Monday. Monday morning, I decide to give the class an experience in dictatorship.
But the student newspaper also wrote that it ended at lunchtime on Wednesday. So we are talking about maybe 2.5 days. And to overcome this and to sell this idea that there was this huge movement and this psychological process and everybody was joining in, and Americans are just as susceptible to totalitarian movements as the continental Europeans of the time, this entire idea falls flat if you think it was only 2.5 days. So the student website claims it was either 5 days until Friday, and this is the most general line out Mr. Jones presents, or it continued until the Wednesday of the following week. I think that we are actually talking about 3 days. I have not any evidence for this, right? But keep that in mind, that potentially we are talking about exactly 2.5 days. What did happen, according to the school newspaper, was rather the opposite. It was not everybody getting very excited about Mr. Jones' ideas. The paper writes, one group reportedly had 500 parents backing a boycott to remove Jones as a teacher because of a movement they did not quite understand. His 5th period senior government class launched the most successful coup d'etat on Wednesday, April the 5th, the last day of the movement, as they kidnapped Jones and threatened to deliver lectures on democracy to his sophomore classes. However, he persuaded them to let him go, telling them he had planned to end the movement that day with a rally at lunch. So lunchtime it was over. And 500 parents got involved, at least, to get him removed. He also spread the rumor that the principal or the director of the school also did this hand gesture at some point. Mr. Jones was fired from that school 2 years later. So maybe it was just 2.5 days. Let's just go with it could be 5. So the official story is that the 4th day was either about vision, strength through vision, or strength through pride.
This is the biggest climate strike ever in history, and we all should be so proud of ourselves because we have done this together.
And this dichotomy comes from his inability to decide whether his movement was about authoritarianism or fascism. Apparently he tries to smear people, or Americans in particular, as potential fascists. And this is a big part actually of his experiment, as you will see. And what supposedly happened on day 4 was that he announced that the movement is national, and that they would see the national leader of the movement the following day. That would be Friday. More is not known about this 4th day. There's also a problem with how many pupils were actually involved. He claims that people joined in. I doubt that you have a big impact on only 3 classes. That's the most common reading so far. There are 3 classes, and you only spend an hour with each class, and then you have all these psychological deep changes, and everybody gets startled with that experiment, and it's so mind-changing that it has to be stopped for fear of spreading internationally, and so on and so on. It's little more than something either about the vision of being a global movement and seeing a leader and taking pride in your community. It's very unclear. He tries to link it to fascism, but what could be his motivation for the experiment in the first place, and I will come back to that later, is that he may have just checked out how far he can go with authoritarianism. The most contemporary source, the student newspaper, says the experiment ended on the 5th of April.
He mentioned that other high schools were participating all around the country, and that we were going to be meeting our national leader at a rally at the end of the week.
Tomorrow at 12 o'clock, we'll have a rally.
2 weeks later, on the 21st of April, both in 1967, they wrote, quote, "A mirror is a deadly weapon," unquote, reflected Kabbalah history teacher Mr. Ron Jones regarding a revolutionary concept of teaching history that is the basis for his The Wave, a form of fascism employed 2 weeks ago by his 2nd, 3rd, and 6th period, so for more contemporary word classes. It is not quite clear how he could indoctrinate so many students successfully in such a short period of time, even if it was 1.5 weeks. I don't know how much time a history teacher gets to speak to one particular class. What is more confusing is that he is trying to present himself as being a little bit forgetful. He is a Stanford graduate, but apparently he cannot even remember if his students were 15 or 16 years old. There was an appearance on the German TV show Johannes Belkana, in which he does not assure straight up that his students were the age that they were.
Die waren so 16, glaube ich. Also 16, ja, 15, 16 Jahre alt.
No.
15, 16.
And this would not be a problem if it were just an old teacher, maybe not a very smart teacher, but you know, after having peddled that story for decades, when it has been turned into movies and theater plays and books and cartoons and so on. He most certainly has heard often enough that his students are 15 years of age. And you see that one of his students, or supposed students, shakes her head when he does not remember quite well how old they were. And I must say that some of his students apparently make money out of this narrative.
I have dedicated my life, the balance of my life, to community service. I speak around the world in schools that use the wave story to bring about discussions of the issues that it raises.
But others could be suffering from false memory. That is a psychological condition many people have when something is long ago and you have not really paid much attention to it at the time. Your memory is incomplete. And when somebody comes along and says, do you remember how that and this happened? False information can be added to your actual memory, and you will remember it in future as if it actually happened. So even though she could have been maybe 14 or 16, or the experiment didn't take place, or she was in a different room, or some aspects of it were wrong, she is most certainly convinced, because of all the theater plays and the cinema movie and so on, that she was 15 years of age at the time and that all of her classmates were of that age. I'm not saying that they were not, but that reaction, that shaking of her head, assuring that she knows supposedly better, seems like she is filling in her own memory with what she had heard more recently and is very sure of something and tries to correct him as he tries to present himself as being a little bit forgetful and old and so on. What adds to this narrative is that he claims to have told the students to never tell anybody about the experiment.
Das habe ich klar gesagt. Und noch etwas. Ich habe gesagt, wir werden dies alles beenden. Und ihr werdet.
This is to assure that they all would think, yes, maybe I have not told my husband or somebody else about what happened because there was this agreement. It was not so important to me, but it could have happened, as Mr. Jones says. So this is a psycho trick he is playing. As I say, he is a Stanford graduate. He absolutely knows what he does. The problem is that this experiment is not just mentioned in this article, but in another one. And I think it says on the website of the students that there is even a third article where it is mentioned. So straight up from very shortly after that experiment, he himself told students of the student newspaper editorial board that this experiment took place and others joined in. A year later, he started a second experiment, very similar. The newspaper reads, culminating a soft cell lecture on cultural shock in the United States with a blunt plea for revolution. Copper Lee history teacher Mr. Ron Jones played games with his first, second, and fourth period contemporary world classes by exposing them to a simulated environment 2 weeks ago, resembling last year's fascist third wave movement. And this one is about a communist ideology. And again, he seems to pedal back only afterwards that it is all just an experiment. It really does not, it is not really there to indoctrinate his students, and he is not into blindly following this or that group. And you've heard that, yes, as an afterthought, he also sometimes mentions Western values and freedom.
I also learned the importance of our freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, because we lost those in that class, and I appreciated their value when I didn't have them. I learned the importance of sticking to your values when you have difficult decisions.
I was stunned that no one stood up and protested and no one spoke out. And I was amazed at how easy students gave up their freedom.
But very strange, he is also a member of a number of cultish movements himself. For example, when he introduced his the second experiment that I've just mentioned, he admits to his students after the game is over and he clears that up, that he is actually a member of the SDS, the student movement for the democratic society, as it was called. It was a communist movement, blatantly communist. And he also joined the National Guard because he says, I belong to every club that I can belong to. I belong to every club I can belong to. That was the strategy of the time. It goes back to a German communist called Rudi Dutschke. He proposed that communists should march through the institutions. That was called the Long March through the institutions, or the March through the institutions, based on Mao Zedong's Shong. I probably pronounced that incorrectly, and of course I do not apologize. Mr. Jones claims that at least 2 more teachers at his very school are in that SDS movement. So he is part of a cultish movement himself that he blindly follows, and not only that, he is part of the Black Panthers who do not do this but that. He says of the school system: our school system is very successful in teaching 3 things: racism, conformity, and competition. The public schools, he felt, were doing more harm than good by not teaching students to love, to cooperate, to be productive, to have mutual respect, to be creative, or to inquire and investigate. The mentioned article of the 4th of March in 1970 also says that Mr. Jones is fed up with today's institutions, which he feels have lost all contact with the people and with a sterile society which has ceased to change. In a February 17th interview, he says, to bring about change, we call for a full-scale revolution. In the same article, he says the dam will either work or burst, and I see it bursting because it cannot tolerate humanization. It's gotten to the point where, to be a complete human being, one must become a revolutionary. In an interview with the student newspaper on the 4th of March 1970, Mr. Jones says about the Black Panthers and other radical groups like this SDS: radical groups and revolutionaries are extremely important because they act as an alarm system. We can respond to that alarm, he said, by ripping it off the wall, or maybe stopping to think about what it's saying. Our salvation will be these alarm systems. If they are ignored long enough, there will be disaster. What also changed, obviously, is that the movement or the wave was supposedly about fascism. The students' website says explicitly that Mr. Jones did not test the gods and tried to stir up some anti-Semitism or racism of any sorts in his class. And still, they emphasize again and again, when they talk about the story, that some racism or some fascism had taken place. And to protect you from being involved in such a movement, you have to look for equality and that kind of stuff.
The most important message by being here in Israel is that at some point in your life you're going to experience injustice or inequality, and at some point in your life you'll have to stand up to struggle against that.
And there's even one student of his that says very explicitly that what he's learned from that experiment was to select the group on what they say. So the more cuddly they sound towards your own interests, the more likely it is not a fascist movement.
The most important lesson I learned was be careful who you follow, because you never know where they're going to lead you. Trust became a huge issue and a major lesson in each other. So I look personally for groups that are loving and inclusive, and not groups that are hateful and exclude people. And that's one of the main things I learned from the wave, watching it swirl around me at the time.
The project was not about fascism at all. Mr. Jones repeatedly says and continues to say that what spawned the interest of that project was his fight against the Vietnam War.
One important thing about our wave story is it started out as a game with Ron and similar to our early experiments, but then when he told us it was real and told us we were going to do this great new third party and change the world for the better, part of the attraction of that to our class was that we were not mostly supportive of the Vietnam War, so we were going to try and run the country better than the politicians in Washington, D.C., and start a new third party that would get us out of the war. And so
You want to be against the war in Vietnam? Let me see your hands, please.
That was the year 1967, and what he wanted the students to rebel against was the military service, and the accusation that Americans were just like Nazis, an accusation that he keeps repeating until today, is based on his assertion that the Vietnam War is just as bad, or is just the same thing as the World War, and that the Americans were just as susceptible to propaganda as the Nazis. His own experiment with the rebellious students and the 500 parents getting involved actually disproves that. But he continues to claim that the Vietnam War is like the World War, and Americans are just as susceptible to authoritarianism as continental Europeans, particularly those at the time. And this follows, of course, this entire all cultures are equal idea that we still hear today. So this entire cuddly, sweet rhetoric goes on to present the group that you should select to follow blindly. It is never about critical thinking, it is never about freedom, it is never about an inquisitive mind. It is about follow this group, don't follow that group. Very blunt, actually, with some lies strewn in, but the overall message of the left has always been follow me, don't follow them. Very, very blunt, very dumb. And he says, at present, his definition of revolution does not include violence, but he indicated that if conditions worsened, his positions could change. And his position actually did change. It already changed within that interview, because he continues with, violence is terrible and ugly, but I can understand violence, the anger and frustration which lead to it. One must ask, what is the realm of violence in the United States? The government is violent to the underprivileged and poverty-stricken. The city landlord is violent. The police are violent towards the Panthers, the Black Panthers here. The business community has been violent for 300 years. The business community, so everybody who has a shop is violent. Violence is one means of communication, a very justifiable means, because it's an alarm system, because it's an alarm system, but I can't operate in that way yet. Maybe tomorrow I will. He sounded an ominous note when he said every spirit that's free will be there. These people are not driven by a utopia, they are driven by power hunger and by a need for violence. These people love violence for the sake of it. And Mr. Jones is not different. He just says that he doesn't like violence because he is in a minority, and if he had openly said so, the entire nice cuddly rhetoric would have fallen flat, and he would have been attacked by authorities himself. So let that think for a moment. You have a radical, panther supporting socialist who is in the National Guard and in every club available to undermine society, presenting a very flawed story, and that propaganda machine keeps rolling and rolling and rolling. Books are made, and cinema movies are rolled out, and so are many more products in that mold, and nobody is asking questions. You know, how many actors who wanted to play their roles nicely were actually going through the documents and looked at the websites and thought, okay, on day 4, what actually happened on that one? What happened on that vision day? He announced that there will be a leader talking to you next day. Yes, but is that filling up the entire hour? Why is the first day so much more interesting than the last one? And why doesn't he talk a lot about the 4th day? And why did the experiment end on a Wednesday when he has only an explanation of what happened during 5 days at best? And how is he talking about fascism and discrimination and Nazism and racism and so on all the time, plus the Vietnam War being all of that, while he has not touched these topics at all in the experiment. There are 100 questions that would arise if any journalist, any actor would have asked these questions. And yet there is a theater play in Jerusalem, there is a musical going on, there's everything, and nobody ever asked these questions. Thank you for listening, and as always, like, share, subscribe, and applause.